on this note, we will next go to our keynote speaker for the evening. We all can agree that this year has been one of the most challenging years in recent history. From concerns about the pandemic, climate change contributing to fires in the West, in Australia, to police brutality both in Canada and south of the border. This year has been unlike any other. Every year at an annual general meeting, MCIS has a keynote speaker who presents experiences and knowledge on relevant topics as a means of encouraging discussion over social justice issues and inspiring thoughts among our attendees.
This year, MCIS is honored to have Niambi Martin-John, a social change champion, community developer, advocate, and empowering partner who has dedicated her career to increasing capacity for marginalized, racialized, and at-risk communities. Coming from Dominica, Martin-John will be talking about her hometown, its colonial history, and how it was impacted by the slave trade and Black movements in the last century. She will also discuss her experiences in North America, explore what it means and feels to be Black in completely different historical and social settings, and explore how she perceives her Black identity through race and culture. Tying in what has happened in the world this year, we're looking forward to hearing her thoughts and views on the Black Lives Matter movement. Without further ado, please help me welcome Niambi Martin-John.
Thank you for having me here tonight to speak with you. It's a great honor to connect with the MCIS family, the board of directors, distinguished guests, awardees, volunteers and staff, as well as all of the generous funders who help it to make it possible to break down language barriers and increase capacity and opportunity for Canadians of all backgrounds. I was born in Dominica, an island in the Eastern Caribbean that is often mistaken for the more well-known Spanish-speaking Dominican Republic. Dominica, or La Dominique, is only 290 square miles and lies between the French territories of Guadeloupe to the north and Martinique to the south. So our official language of business and education is English, but Dominicans also speak French Creole patois, as well as something which is called Cocoy, which is an English dialect adopted in some parts of the island. The indigenous people of Dominica are the Arawakan Carib Indians, who came to the Caribbean islands from the banks of the Orinoco River in South America. The Arawaks called Dominica Kairi, and the Caribs referred to Dominica as Waitukubuli, meaning tall is her body. On November 3rd, 1493, Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the island, and I say stumbled very deliberately. It was a Sunday, and so he named the island Dominica after the Spanish word for Sunday, domingo. Dominica held very little appeal for the Spanish, who at the time were mostly concerned about the pursuit of gold, and therefore they did not create a settlement on the island as we lacked this particular resource. So for more than a century after Christopher Columbus's visit, Dominica was populated only by its native inhabitants. It was the French then who first established settlements in Dominica to harvest timber from its dense forests. And it was also the French who first brought enslaved African people to Dominica to provide free labor for their activities. In the 1700s, Dominica was repeatedly fought over and changed hands between the French and British several times as they began to recognize Dominica for its strategic position as a military outpost, as well as being beneficial for its natural resources. Each of those colonial superpowers engaged in the slave trade, bringing thousands of Africans to the island's shores. As a result, the number of Blacks in Dominica grew so significantly that it wasn't long before a large maroon population that were able to outmaneuver and out-evade and outsmart the Europeans evolved. They utilized their relationships with the native tribes, as well as their knowledge of the island's topography, to gain whatever advantage they could and to begin a foundation for a revolutionary people. When slavery was abolished in 1843, Dominica had already established a highly organized group of free Blacks. They owned both lands and businesses, much to the chagrin and detriment of the European settlers. In 1848, Dominica became the first British territory to have a Black-controlled legislature in the 19th century. This is the stock from which I come. By the time I was born in the mid-70s, there was a healthy and thriving Afrocentric movement. My parents were strongly identified with the Black Power movement and the African liberation movement. It was commonplace in my home to find pro-Black literature and overhear conversations about Nelson Mandela, apartheid South Africa, or local and regional activists like Rosie Douglas, who is a Dominican that made significant contributions in the fight for equality for Blacks and Natives here in Canada, and Maurice Bishop, a Grenadian revolutionary concerned with the liberation and empowerment of Blacks. With such a background, it shouldn't be surprising then to learn that I grew up with a healthy sense of self, awareness of slavery, colonialism, and the brutal injustices suffered by Blacks. However, it is said that we see things usually as we are and not necessarily as they are. For me, one of these things was my race. With the majority of whites abandoning Dominica after the abolition of slavery, 95% of the population are people of African descent or mixed heritage. On the island, therefore, even though many like me are highly educated about our heritage and perhaps even came out of homes where the quest for equality was part of a proactive and organized movement, the truth is race, and specifically being Black, isn't an issue that requires us to give pause as we go about our day-to-day activities. In fact, I would say that we celebrate our Blackness as a construct more closely related to our cultural rather than our racial identity. You see, the reality is that as a Black person on the island, everyone looks like you, and even those who do not have a kinship to Blacks on the basis of a shared Caribbean or cultural experience that transcends racial barriers for the most part. We eat the same foods, we dance to the same music, we wear the same national dress, we speak the same language. Black Dominicans cook curry, Indian Dominicans speak Creole patois, which is a mix of French and African dialects. Native Dominicans play our cultural or traditional kadas music and dance our traditional ballet. And they also houkle or lavwe, which is a practice of chanting that started on African slave ships. Our elected officials look like us. And there's never a time when we would have to declare our race to access things like medical care in a hospital or on a form to register for a course at school. In that space, I would never have to apologize for my race, shrink myself, or move with caution so that someone could feel comfortable in my presence. So I must confess to you that I never understood my Blackness until I was 18 years old and moved to the United States to attend college. I had simply lacked the context for what being Black meant in the broader sense. I had been cocooned in a safety net that prevented me from picking up on the many cues and microaggressions linked to racism. And I would have to reshape my perspective on Blackness to truly grasp how others viewed me and what access and space would be ascribed to me on the basis of those preconceptions due to my race. I didn't know how the varied experiences with slavery, post-slavery, and emancipation affected the current lives of Blacks outside of the Caribbean, specifically in North America, and how cultural, economic, and political rights were not afforded in the same way to all people of the African diaspora. One of the immediate barriers I think I faced was that I had been exposed to so many deliberately constructed negative images of American Blackness in the media that I had inadvertently bought into them. I viewed African Americans with a mixture of admiration, disdain, and confusion all at the same time. I was highly offended when anyone described me or labeled me as African American, and I would take great pains to distance myself from them, something that I have found to be common among non-African American Blacks. I reasoned that this was because I was not in fact African, and neither was I American, and I felt that such a label was absolutely unnecessary and even counterintuitive. How could anyone whose people had fought against oppression turn around and label themselves in a way that made them seem like they did not belong? In my mind, this defeated the entire purpose of liberation and the civil rights movement, because by imposing this identifier of African Americans on themselves, they seem to be affirming the white supremacist view that they were less than. I would not be associated with this in any way. So on campus, I began to separate myself from any African Americans, judging their music, their gatherings, their dress, even their academic performance. I felt no kinship to them around racial identity, and I would regularly ponder the supposed plight of African Americans that they talked about, concluding often that they were all of those things that the media had told me. But the universe has a way of teaching us about ourselves that often lands us in positions where we are compelled to seek allies in order to overcome the many obstacles that are thrown at us. I began to experience microaggressions that would soon lead me to confront my own biases about the African American experiences. It started with a professor. She was both condescending and passive aggressive to Caribbean students. West Indians are very passionate people, and when we would get together as a group, we would often be very loud, often talking about our various islands, with each claiming to have the best water, the best beaches, best recipes, best carnival, or whatever little thing we could vibe about as Caribbean people. Sometimes we would talk about politics, religion, Rastafarianism, deep conversations about culture and culture shock, and escapism, of course, from small town America. This professor had a class that was dismissed from a room where many of us would be waiting to go to our next class. And without fail, every week she would meet us with the same greeting, a snide remark: "You people are always fighting." At first, I didn't know what this statement was. I only knew that "you people" did not feel like a term of endearment. Who were these people that we represented to her? And we weren't fighting. Far from it. We were the only support system and the only link to home that each other had. We were actually a very tight, loyal, and supportive group. A few times we replied to her comment with laughter, attempting to engage her in discussion to dispel her notion that we were fighting. But it continued week after week until the semester ended. And by then, it was clear as day what this was. This was racism, discrimination, her cultural incompetence, and a targeted and prolonged attempt to shame us for being different. On one occasion, a professor administered a test that was so difficult that the majority of the class failed. The only students to pass the test were the 5 Caribbean students, including me, who were enrolled in the course. Instead of awarding us our passing grade, we were failed, and we were reported to the dean for cheating, helping each other to pass, he said in his argument. By then, of course, I would have faced enough instances of discrimination, both overt and covert, to understand his motivation. If his best white students could not pass, how could 5 Black students from the Caribbean? Thankfully, fate intervened that day as we had all arrived late for class and had to take seats separate from each other wherever we could find them in the lecture hall. There was just no way we could have helped each other. And the dean also happened to know that we were all performing well above average in all of our courses and actually ended up siding with us in the dispute. However, I would say that things were never the same for us after that. Professors would look at us with great scrutiny in various classes because I assume that the word had been spread that we must be operating under some special kind of voodoo to excel in this program. I say this jokingly, of course, but what I want to convey is that a single person's misconceptions and prejudices were able to permeate an entire academic institution so deeply that students of color in this program would be burdened with the additional encumbrance to manage the expectations of professors and dispel any notion of having some type of unfair advantage or that we were aiding each other to achieve academic excellence. If I have to point to a single defining moment that was a catalyst for me to determine a path to better understand being Black in America, I would point specifically to this experience. I was confronted with an ugly truth that day, that being Niambi from Dominica in the Caribbean was inconsequential to my experiences in America, and that to navigate that space, I would have to do my due diligence to grasp the historical factors that shape how African Americans existed within a Eurocentric elitist system designed specifically to exclude them. I would have to find my voice to defend not just my Blackness, but the Blackness of others, whether West Indian or American, because to the outside world, we were all just Black people. Black people today continue to face significant systemic obstacles that have impacted the trajectory of their lives for generations. Social and economic disparities stemming from laws that made Black home and land ownership inaccessible or restricted to only certain neighborhoods, ones that lacked any infrastructure to support a thriving community, is an example. Lack of access to institutions of higher education, poverty stemming from unemployment, underemployment, and lack of education, mass incarceration of Black men in particular, and the subsequent erosion of the Black family, police brutality, and the gap in access in healthcare to prevent and treat even diseases that disproportionately affect Blacks are among the common issues that need to be dismantled in order to even the playing field, placing Blacks on par with their white peers. When I moved to Canada more than 20 years ago, I bought into the often told Canadian story about how welcoming we are, how kind and un-American we are in our thinking, and how this is a place for all people, a multicultural melting pot wrapped in politeness and poutine. But as is true for many immigrants, and certainly for people of color, when the fog begins to clear, the complicated truth is exposed. Canada, while different in its indication of racism, is also a place where many of us continue to experience barriers to success. Bilingualism, for example, is considered an asset and a sign of privilege for whites. But for people of color, multilingualism is often used to reinforce that we aren't truly Canadian. In some cases, it's automatically linked to an assumption about one's ability to perform certain jobs, or one's intellect, or the validity or transferability of one's credentials. Throughout my career, I have faced a multitude of racially motivated barriers. Working in the white-dominated field of fund development, my ability to do the job was often questioned because Blacks are not historically seen as sources of philanthropic generosity. If the majority of our donors are white, older white men to be exact, how could a Black woman with an accent, with seemingly such a vastly different life experience, be successful in engaging such people? Remember that Blacks are usually seen as the recipients of philanthropic aid, with images of fly-riddled, sick and starving children in Africa being the predominant narrative exported to reinforce this. And so on many occasions, I was forced to constantly defend, explain, review, and justify my work, even to those who, knowing my expertise, had hired me to do a particular job. On occasion, even volunteers to organizations I have worked for have challenged me simply because I am Black. On one occasion, an individual asked me if I was sure that I was the director after she asked to speak to the person in charge and I was called. After I confirmed that yes, I was in fact the person who had earned such a title, she proceeded with one of the most beautiful displays of microaggressions that I have experienced to this day. She wanted to know where I was from. And with each response that I was from Canada, just like her, she became increasingly agitated and frustrated. No, I mean, where are you from? No, I mean your people. Where are your people from? Sadly, I wish I could tell you that this experience for Blacks is the exception rather than the rule, but it isn't. And what's even worse is that in many organizations where leadership fails to provide a supportive and safe environment for people of color, these situations are often laughed off, swept under the carpet, and never confronted. People of color are often left feeling humiliated and carry the burden of workplace anxiety, stress, and trauma because they are forced to choose between being employed or standing up against racist, inappropriate behavior. It is exhausting and it is frustrating to be able to count on one hand the number of people of color at professional conferences in a sea of hundreds of faces, or to take stock of your organizational chart only to grasp that you're the only Black person in a leadership role. It is exasperating to sit at a table where you've earned your rightful place and then to be asked to not let your intelligence be so obvious among your peers because they will be threatened by you. No white person would ever be asked to make such an accommodation. In fact, they would be celebrated for contributing over and above their assigned portfolio and promoted through the ranks at a disproportionately alarmingly fast rate. As we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, I felt it was critical for me to first share my story with you because people make the assumption that all Black people and people of color, by extension, share a singular story. Again, this is a way to diminish the potency of our stories and to cripple the movement to end racism. If all of our stories are the same, then we can be easily dismissed as part of the same old, same old. So while we acknowledge the intersections of our Black experience, it is important to note and understand that even Black people come to the table with decidedly different views and experiences around their racial identity and the expression of this identity. The one thing that unites us in the Black Lives Matter movement is our commitment to eradicating white supremacy by elevating and amplifying conversations about racial injustice and inequities, while advocating for policy changes to dismantle the systemic barriers that limit access for people of color. During the recent US presidential debate, Donald Trump was asked to condemn white supremacists and militia groups. Trump responded, "Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what, somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left." This isn't the first time that this person, holding one of the most respected offices in the world, has missed an opportunity to categorically condemn white supremacy. It also isn't the first time that his failure to do so has actually energized and emboldened many who hold the view that being from the white race makes them superior to people of color, and that they have the agency to diminish and destroy those lives at will. The historical socialization of whites has afforded them great power and privilege, including an affirmation that all spaces were created for them to dominate. It is that which nurtures and feeds the ideology of white superiority that builds up systemic barriers for people of color, particularly Black people. When we say Black Lives Matter, we aren't asking for special treatment for Black people. What we are asking for is for the broad acknowledgement that the system is broken, that stereotypes, mistreatment, and expulsion of Black people from spaces where they can acquire power or continue to be threatened, and that our very existence is at stake. Blackness is not a uniform or costume. We cannot take it off in the morning before facing the world. Blackness is not something that I can hide, disguise, or diminish to grant me access to spaces that I have been shut out of. My race is not a choice. The emergence then of the Black Lives Matter movement, and certainly the reactivation of a unified call in 2020, is both critical and timely. The world needs to know that Black people require true freedom still today. And Black people needed this rallying cry to rise up and take ownership of the movement to free themselves once again. We need the people who oppress us to be held accountable for the injustices that are leveled against us more intensely and purposefully than against any other race. The judges, police officers, teachers, CEOs, healthcare providers, religious leaders, gatekeepers, owners of affluence, influence, and space, to cite a few. The work required isn't easy. It's not easy work. The conversations are uncomfortable. Being an ally will require deep introspection and a suspension of those biases that are often deeply ingrained in our psyche about who people are. It will require us to name things for what they are, like racism and discrimination and white privilege. It may mean losing friends. It may mean losing associates along the way, and overcoming deep frustration and disappointment that we may feel when those we thought held the same views as us desert us during this journey. It will require a steadfastness and a resilience in the face of grave injustice simply because you dared to stand on the side of social change. There's a quote that I enjoy from a civil rights activist. Her name is Mary McLeod Bethune. She's a philanthropist and an educator, and it states, "If we accept and acquiesce in the face of discrimination, we accept the responsibility ourselves and allow those responsible to salve their conscience by believing that they have our acceptance and our concurrence. We should therefore protest openly everything that smacks of discrimination and slander. If you are so inclined, please help me share their stories. Do you know their names? Amadou Diallo, Trayvon Martin, Jonathan Farrell, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Dontre Hamilton, Michael Brown Jr., John Crawford III, Tanisha Anderson, Freddie Gray, Botham Jean, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, too numerous to mention. Do you know what they did? Do you know why they died? Standing outside of the apartment building where you live while Black, wearing a hoodie while Black, standing outside a store while Black, driving down the street while Black, sleeping in your bed while Black, sitting on your couch while Black, selling DVDs outside of a gas station while Black, going for a jog while Black, walking in an affluent neighborhood while Black, playing with a toy gun while Black, simply holding your cell phone while Black, playing in the park with your child while Black, sleeping in your car while Black, visiting friends while Black, suffering from mental illness while Black, calling the police for help while Black. Hey, you, where are you going? Where did you come from? Do you have ID? Do you have a weapon? Do you have warrants? You look like someone we're looking for. Why are you wearing that hoodie? Whose car is this? Do you have a permit for that? You can't swim here. You can't eat here. Why are you walking in this neighborhood? Do you live here? While Black. Thank you.
Wow, a big hand of applause for Niambi. Niambi, thank you so much for sharing such an engaging and yet so personal stories. I must say, you know, we are very lucky to have you speak this evening. We greatly appreciate your personal experiences that you brought to us tonight. Thank you so much from the management at MCIS, the board of directors, and the team at MCIS. Thanks so much. Greatly appreciate your talk. Thank you.